There are moments when governments stop negotiating in sentences and start negotiating in steel. The microphones are still on. The diplomats are still smiling. The briefings still use words like contingency and readiness. But somewhere behind the language, something heavier begins to move. And when 100,000 tons of nuclear-powered leverage starts changing course, it is not theater. It is preparation. The Pentagon is preparing to send a second American carrier strike group into the Middle East, not labeled as escalation, not framed as an ultimatum. Officially, it is flexibility. Unofficially, it is mass. Flight decks, reactor cores, layered missile shields, strike packages measured in sorties per hour. And mass does not reposition itself because of headlines. It repositions because timelines are shifting. The USS Gerald R. the most advanced aircraft carrier ever built, is being directed toward waters that are already tense. Alone, a supercarrier is influence. In parallel with another, it becomes architecture. Nearly 200 aircraft between them. Electronic warfare platforms designed to blind before the other side realizes it cannot see. Tomahawk inventories counted not in press releases but in coordinates. At the same time, the language around Tehran has narrowed. If a deal cannot be reached, if compliance cannot be verified, these are not emotional clauses. They are structural escape hatches. They create legal space for kinetic outcomes without ever announcing them. And this is where the real shift begins. Because while negotiations continue in public, steel is synchronizing in private. Deck crews are drilling, escorts are tightening formation. Submarines are already where they are supposed to be, and no one is tweeting their coordinates. When two carrier strike groups operate within range of a contested coastline, that is not signaling. That is capability assembled in advance. So before we break down what changed in the last 48 hours, what triggered the acceleration, and why regional commanders are suddenly recalibrating their posture, understand this. The United States did not raise its voice. It moved its weight. And when weight moves quietly, it usually means the decision was made long before the world was told. Because the deployment order did not emerge in isolation. It followed a closed-door meeting in Washington that lasted 3 hours and ended without public detail. Hours later, the instruction moved through the chain of command. Exercises off the American East Coast were adjusted. Timelines shortened. The option to sail converted from theoretical to immediate. Sequences like this appear administrative, until you connect them. The first carrier is already operating roughly 500 miles south of Iran in the Arabian Sea. Its air wing conducts routine sorties. Destroyers maintain patrol patterns. Submarines remain unacknowledged. Regional bases host squadrons that have not rotated home in months. Missile defense batteries have shifted positions across the Gulf. None of this requires a press conference. It requires synchronization. And synchronization is the detail that rarely appears in headlines. Intelligence briefings in one capital, naval orders in another, public messaging that references prior strikes without describing future ones. The reminder that the last time negotiations stalled, specific facilities were hit, not threatened, hit. That memory is now embedded in the timeline. Inside Iran, the response has been vocal. Military commanders speak of doctrine evolving from defensive to offensive. Advisors warn that any strike would trigger a comprehensive reply. Newspapers aligned with the Revolutionary Guard discuss preparation, endurance, sacrifice, graves reportedly designated in advance. The rhetoric is severe, but rhetoric often conceals calculation. Because Tehran understands geometry as well, two carrier strike groups in proximity do not guarantee an attack. They guarantee capacity. They reduce reaction time. They compress options. When F-35 squadrons appear in Jordan and long-range bombers can reach hardened targets from continental airspace, the distinction between pressure and preparation becomes increasingly thin. Meanwhile, the broader environment is unstable. Iran's currency remains volatile. Water shortages strain urban centers. Protest movements, though suppressed, have not dissolved. A government balancing internal fragility and external confrontation must calculate differently than one operating from stability. Military deterrence abroad does not repair infrastructure at home, but external pressure can unify a fragmented elite temporarily. Washington's messaging has been layered. Public posts referencing speed and consequences. Private deadlines reportedly delivered through back channels. Statements that sound improvised but align precisely with troop movements. It seems insignificant until you connect the sequence. A meeting, an order, a reminder of past strikes, a second carrier. Strategic analysts have begun to describe this posture as the most substantial shift in the region since the eve of Desert Storm. That comparison is not casual. It implies staging rather than signaling. The difference between the two is procedural, not theatrical. Signaling is about influence. Staging is about readiness for execution. Yet no declaration of intent has been issued, no formal ultimatum made public. Negotiations continue in Oman. Technical discussions persist. Verification frameworks are still being drafted. On paper, diplomacy remains alive. On the water, flight decks are aligning. At this point, the system usually shows its limits. When deterrence becomes indistinguishable from preparation, both sides must decide whether the display itself is sufficient. The second carrier is not noise, it is mass. And mass, once in motion, is difficult to reverse without consequence. The question is no longer whether Washington can act. The question is whether it has positioned itself in such a way that inaction begins to look like weakness. And if that perception takes hold, the timeline shortens on its own. Somewhere between conditional statements and nuclear reactors humming beneath steel decks, a threshold has been approached. Not crossed, approached. The structure still holds. The negotiations are still referenced. But the geometry in the Arabian Sea is no longer theoretical. And when geometry changes faster than language can adapt, that is usually the moment before something gives. The structure begins to crack at the point where movement replaces messaging. Once two carrier strike groups are within operational range, the system is no longer posturing. It is calculating execution windows. What changed after the 3-hour meeting was not tone. It was sequencing. Israeli intelligence assessments were reportedly placed alongside U.S. operational plans, not as recommendations, as alignment. The concern was not simply uranium enrichment. It was ballistic missile survivability, hardened facility redundancy, and the timeline to irreversible breakout capability. When those variables are layered together, the margin for extended diplomacy narrows. The presence of a second carrier solves a specific military constraint. A single carrier group can sustain limited strike cycles while maintaining air defense and regional patrol obligations. Two carriers create redundancy. One can project power while the other maintains perimeter security. Sortie rates double. Electronic warfare coverage overlaps. Target packages can be staggered across multiple nights rather than compressed into a single window. That difference is operational, not symbolic. Beyond the carriers, the supporting architecture is already in place. Long-range bombers positioned within reach of deeply buried facilities. F-35 squadrons deployed to regional air bases capable of penetrating advanced air defense systems. Aegis-equipped destroyers configured for both missile interception and land attack cruise missile launch. Patriot and THAAD batteries adjusted to absorb retaliatory ballistic strikes. Submarines positioned without disclosure, carrying payloads that require no airspace clearance. This is not an improvised buildup. It is layered deterrence designed to transition seamlessly into sustained strike operations if authorized. The timeline from decision to first impact would be measured in hours, not weeks. That compression alters diplomatic leverage. It removes the buffer that historically allowed for last-minute recalibration. Tehran's internal adjustments reflect awareness of that compression. Command structures have been modified. Public statements emphasize offensive doctrine. Missile units have conducted visible readiness displays. These are not spontaneous gestures. They are signals to domestic and regional audiences that the leadership retains control of escalation. But the logic is defensive in origin. A regime anticipating possible decapitation or infrastructure degradation must demonstrate continuity. The more consequential factor is internal fragility, currency instability, water scarcity, a protest movement suppressed at high cost. External confrontation can consolidate authority temporarily, but only if the confrontation remains controlled. A limited exchange might reinforce cohesion. A sustained campaign targeting strategic facilities could expose vulnerabilities that are currently masked by centralized control. Washington's calculus operates differently. The objective is not territorial, it is temporal. Delay or eliminate nuclear breakout capability while avoiding a regional war that would destabilize energy corridors and allied governments. That requires calibrated force, enough to degrade infrastructure, not enough to trigger full mobilization across multiple theaters. The dual carrier posture provides that flexibility. However, flexibility narrows once assets are forward deployed. Carrier groups are expensive to maintain in high alert posture. Air wings cannot remain at peak readiness indefinitely. Extended presence increases the probability of miscalculation. An intercept gone wrong, a drone approaching too closely, a missile launch misinterpreted as preemptive action. When forces operate within proximity, accidents inherit strategic weight. There's also the question of private deadlines. Publicly, no ultimatum has been acknowledged. Privately, timelines have reportedly been conveyed. A deadline changes internal deliberations in Tehran. It forces prioritization. Concession risks domestic backlash. Refusal risks external strike. Delay becomes the default tactic. But delay is less effective when strike capacity is already assembled. The system now functions on parallel tracks. Diplomats continue drafting frameworks. Military planners refine target lists. Intelligence agencies monitor enrichment levels and missile dispersal patterns. Political leadership calibrates rhetoric to avoid locking into irreversible commitments. Each track appears independent. In reality, they are synchronized. If negotiations collapse, the infrastructure for action is complete. If negotiations succeed, de-escalation will require visible repositioning of assets that are currently serving as leverage. That repositioning itself would signal outcome. Either way, the current posture is transitional. It cannot remain static without cost. The deeper risk lies in perception. Should Tehran conclude that Washington is committed to action regardless of compliance, it may accelerate its own breakout timeline or initiate asymmetric responses across regional proxies. Conversely, if Washington perceives stalling tactics while military costs accumulate, the incentive to demonstrate resolve increases. Escalation in this context is rarely declared. It is triggered by accumulated mistrust. The geometry in the Arabian Sea is therefore not just physical, it is psychological. Two carrier groups compress space, they compress time, they compress political options. Once compression reaches a certain threshold, decisions no longer feel voluntary, they feel inevitable. No announcement has been made, no strike order signed publicly. But the infrastructure now in place removes ambiguity about capability. And when ambiguity disappears, the remaining variable is intent. Intent in systems under strain tends to clarify abruptly. Intent in systems under strain tends to clarify abruptly. And what makes this particular moment more volatile is not only the forward deployment of naval power, but the density of overlapping red lines. Iran's enrichment levels have reportedly hovered near technical thresholds that significantly reduce breakout time. Advanced centrifuge cascades, once dispersed and experimental, are now more refined and more numerous. Underground facilities have been hardened further, complicating strike modeling. Each incremental technical improvement narrows the window for preemptive action and raises the cost of waiting. At the same time, regional actors are recalibrating. Gulf states are quietly reinforcing air defenses and reviewing contingency evacuation plans for energy infrastructure. Insurance premiums for shipping routes near the Strait of Hormuz have begun to reflect elevated risk assessments. Even without a shot fired, the economic perimeter of the crisis is expanding. Markets price probability long before governments acknowledge it. There's also the proxy dimension. Iranian-aligned groups across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen retain the capacity to target U.S. installations and allied assets asymmetrically. A direct strike on nuclear facilities would not unfold in isolation. It would likely trigger distributed responses calibrated to stretch American resources across multiple fronts without provoking total war. That distributed pressure is difficult to counter with conventional naval dominance alone. For Washington, the dual carrier posture is therefore both deterrent and shield. It signals readiness for decisive action while providing layered defense against retaliation. But it also raises the threshold of credibility. Once such assets are committed, retreat without tangible concessions can erode strategic authority not just in the Middle East, but globally.